so we'll go ahead and get started. It's still like a minute. You might still get some people coming in, but I have to do this other meeting. So I'm proud to introduce Cole Butler, who's a graduate of the Addiction Counseling Program here at CSU, who is going to do a very important presentation on cannabis use disorder, and I'll let him give the primary details about this, but one of the things I'll just want to highlight is that this is, I think, an area of special interest for Cole, and so I'm excited to have him here to do this presentation. I know we don't cover cannabis use disorder a lot in the program, and I think that's one of the reasons I was excited to have Cole here. So thanks all for attending. Unfortunately for me, I can't attend, but Cole's going to send me a copy of the video so I can watch afterwards. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cole. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
It'd be a bummer if I missed it. Oh, okay, nice.
Just pull hard. You just pull hard.
Yes, I'm not.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so happy to be here. Super cool. Not used to standing over here. I'm used to sitting in your seat, but now a couple of years later, I'm back. So yeah, just super stoked. Big thanks to Brad. I guess he'll see that on the video, but for inviting me here, and Patrice helped coordinate, gave me a nice parking pass. But yeah, my name's Cole, and my talk is Unpacking Cannabis Use Disorder. So I'm an addiction counselor candidate, as well as licensed professional counselor candidate. So I did the LPCC track, and just graduated a few months ago, so in August, and had those come through DORA, and now I'm in practice at Inner Life Adventures, which is a small counseling practice in Drake Professional Park. It's just me and my coworker and my supervisor, Chuck. So yeah, and I'm an MACP as well, so a lot of letters behind my name now. So before we get too into it, I want to talk a little bit about like language and terminology, because sometimes people will say you shouldn't call it cannabis, you should call it marijuana, because the cannabis plant may not have THC in it or have very trace levels of THC, but the cannabis indica or cannabis sativa plant actually has about 540 different compounds in it. And the primary psychoactive component is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC. So marijuana is like the plant matter, buds, flowers, sticks, stems, in cannabis, and it's usually THC containing. So that is me looking at a blunt with craving eyes under a blanket, which my best friend is smoking 5 years ago. I was diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder a little over 2 years ago, and have been sober since then. I started smoking cannabis when I was about 15. I'm from a small town in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and yeah, my parents had gotten divorced, and my home life was really chaotic. And I look at it like I didn't really have like a chill place to go back home. I just wanted to hang out with my friends and smoke. So I was smoking pretty heavily, and it really peaked in college when I was dabbing all day, every day. If you don't know what dabs are, I'm definitely going to talk more about that, but it's high dose THC concentrates, also called wax, shatter, these kinds of things. So I was an undergrad in psychology, and I was dabbing pretty much all day, every day, doing a big dab, going to class, doing another dab, going back to class, and then by the evening time, it was like, now I can do an even bigger one. So yeah, it was pretty heavy. I also started selling it, so I was getting it shipped in from Portland, and I thought I'd make some side money and pay my rent and get some groceries and beer money, but actually I was just supporting my habit. So yeah, I smoked away pretty much all my profit, and it just meant I was smoking more. I struggled to quit for about 10 years. So I'm 27 now, but when I was 15, I started and stopped when I was 25. And pretty much the whole time I would repeatedly try and quit, but I would fail to. So usually somebody would offer me some on the weekend, and I'd be like, sure, no problem. I could smoke a little on the weekend, and then I'd be like, I don't want to be a mooch. Let me buy some more weed. And then I'd have my own, and then I had no self-control. So I'd smoke all of it. When I came to Colorado, I decided to get sober, joining the same program right before I came. And I said that I should be able to do it myself if I'm going to be able to do that for other people. So yeah, I got sober, came to Colorado, joined this program, but after 100 days I lapsed. You may or may not have already heard this term, just lapse and relapse. But a relapse is when you fall off the wagon and get back on. Lapse is kind of like you slip up and then you get sober again. So I found an addiction counselor candidate who helped me out. I believe she's licensed now, but I was in therapy for a couple of years, just getting some support. So you kind of have to lay out the basic framework of addiction. I just call it Addiction 101. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but when I talk about this issue to the broader community of people who don't understand what addiction is, I often get these kind of criticisms of people saying weed cannot be addictive, and it's just not true. It's not about the weed itself, it's about the relationship to it. So most people who use weed and most other substances for that matter are not going to become addicted to them. It's a small minority of people, and those are the people who need the help. So yeah, and any substance or behavior that affects the dopamine system can form an addiction. So you'll learn more about that in pharmacology. Ryan taught my pharmacology class, and it's really fascinating, but I'm sure you'll all learn more about the medical model of addiction. But I'm going to talk about that because it's really important when we're talking about cannabis use disorder. So about 1 in every 5 people who uses cannabis will have a cannabis use disorder. The rates vary, but I've seen them up to 30% of people who use cannabis. So it's pretty prevalent, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. So again, you may or may not have already seen this, but when you're diagnosing any substance use disorder, you diagnose it according to the severity. So there's 11 different symptoms. I'll go through them, but essentially if you have 2 or 3 symptoms, that would indicate a mild substance use disorder. 4 or 5 would be moderate, which is what I was diagnosed with, and 6+ symptoms is considered severe. So yeah, you can just have 2 symptoms. You'll have a mild cannabis use disorder. In the DSM-4 and the DSM-3, that was just called cannabis dependence, and then like a moderate or severe is kind of analogous to cannabis abuse. So I'm kind of going to walk through these and then talk about what they mean in the context of cannabis use. So the first one is taking the substance in larger amounts or for longer than you're meant to. So for me, this would look like I'm just going to take a few hits off of a bowl, and then by the end of the night I've had 3 or 4 bowls, or I'm smoking blunts or doing dabs or whatever. It's just like once that train started, it just continued. Number 2, wanting to cut down or stop using the substance but not managing to. So just like I said, failing to quit, saying I want to quit, not doing it. Number 3, spending a lot of time using or recovering from use of the substance. Number 4, cravings and urges to use the substance. Number 5, not managing to do what you should at work, home, or school because of substance use. So this can be skipping homework, not going to class, not doing your chores, being late to work. Number 6, continuing to use even when it causes problems in relationships. So that could look like, your spouse has a problem with it, your child, your parents. Number 7, giving up important social, occupational, or recreational activities because of the substance. That can look like staying home and smoking weed all weekend because you only want to do that. You don't want to show up to the extracurricular events or get out of the house. Number 8, using substances again and again, even when it puts you in danger. This can be, again, smoking at work if you work in like a physical environment, like construction, for example, or even driving high. Number 9, continuing to use even when you know you have a physical or psychological problem that could have been caused or made worse by the substance. A really clear example of this one is cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which I'll talk more about later, but it's essentially vomiting a bunch because you smoked way too much. Number 10, needing more of the substance to get the effect you want, or a tolerance. You're probably all familiar with tolerance, but if you smoke every day, you're probably going to develop a tolerance and need more weed to get high. Number 11, development of withdrawal symptoms, which can be relieved by taking more of the substance. So a lot of people think that there's no withdrawal symptoms associated with cannabis use, which is not true. They just look a lot different. You know, you're not violently shaking on a hospital bed. This is what you would see. So I have observed this in people. I worked on clinical trials where I saw this. Somebody would be a super heavy smoker, and then they would stop, and then they would be like, I can't go to sleep, I can't eat, I need my weed. Anxiety, irritability, anger, aggression. You have a question? Yeah.
Sorry, not to interrupt, but are the less
okay.
common symptoms for more severe, like, you have more severe withdrawal symptoms? The less common?
I see what you're saying. I wouldn't say that necessarily, because the more common ones can be pretty severe. I would just say you observe them less. That may be true that the less common ones are more severe, but they certainly look that way.
Or I guess like, if your addiction is more severe, you would experience like the physical.
You would
It looks like the second list is more like physiological than mental.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't exactly know. But yeah, in general, the more severe that your addiction is, the more severe withdrawal symptoms you're gonna have because your body becomes more attuned to constant use of the substance, and you rip it away, and that causes all sorts of problems in your brain. So some common questions and concerns. It's pretty common for people to say, is weed really addictive? When I was growing up in Arkansas, I got a lot of that. Weed's not addictive, you know, it's just not, and that's not necessarily true. Again, I would go back to, it's not about the weed itself, it's about the nature of your relationship to it. So just because you smoke weed, you can not have an addictive relationship to it. You can use weed non-problematically, that's fine. I don't care if people are smoking weed or not. I use this to treat my XYZ, so cannabis is a medicine. Indeed it is, in certain cases. So yeah, you can use it to treat your PTSD, Crohn's, all sorts of intense things it's helpful for. However, we need to look at what the research has shown that cannabis can be used for, and not overgeneralize. You have a question?
Crohn's disease?
Crohn's disease?
Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah. Stomach problems, excessive diarrhea.
Yeah. Just eats away at their stomach, right? Kind of thing. Like your body's. That's what my buddy who had it said. It like eats away at your body.
Yeah, I don't know a ton about Crohn's disease specifically, and I could be wrong. I've heard that because I think my brother struggles with it, and he uses a lot of dabs and stuff, and he says it helps. Don't quote me on it, but look it up. But I've heard that before. Actually, my next slide, I'll talk about what the actual conditions that Colorado has approved marijuana for are. So another one, I have had somebody tell me this. He was a dispensary owner, and he had a problem with me saying that I had a problem smoking. And so he said, yeah, I dab like 5 times a day. I wake up clear-headed. It's not a problem for me, so you know this is not a problem. And he said, that's your personal problem. But what I would say is if you stop smoking and you're doing 5 dabs a day, you're very likely to develop withdrawal symptoms. But also, again, like, I don't care if people are smoking and they want to smoke, even if they're using it in an addictive type way, or in very large amounts. I'm really not trying to preach or shove abstinence down anybody's throat or tell people they shouldn't do something. I don't particularly care what people do in their personal lives unless they're asking for help, in which case that's what I want to help. So yeah, to your point, these are the conditions which Colorado has assigned for medical marijuana. Obviously, you can go get some weed from the dispensary without having this, but that's not true in all states, not true in my home state. But again, like, I just want to make the point that there are certain conditions for which medical marijuana is indicated, and we need to be careful not to overgeneralize. You see this a lot with like CBD and stuff, like people are like, it's a cure-all, but it's not. Cannabis is not a magic bullet. However, there are certain use cases which, if you want to use it for those cases, totally cool. But some of these, like AIDS, HIV, PTSD, autism spectrum disorder, these are the kinds of things we're looking at, and your doctor has to believe that marijuana will help. So it's not super clear the role of genetics. Genetics play a role in cannabis use disorder expression. But there's no one like target gene. However, we can look at heritability, which is just a lot easier to measure. If your parent has it, will you get it? And we see ranging heritability rates, but really it's around 50%. So if your parent has a cannabis use disorder, you have a 50-50 shot at getting it. But obviously, like the environment that you're in, your genetics, your support system, that all plays a role. So I have a friend who, every time he goes home for Christmas, his entire family is smoking weed together. You hear about this also with like alcohol, like it becomes like a social norm in the family. So that's when you might see some of that stuff. So super important to take into consideration when we're talking about cannabis use disorder is that the potency rates of THC have risen drastically over the past 20 years and really over the past 40 years. What you see is like in 95, it was a little less than 4%, but if you go back to like the 70s, it was like 1%, 0.5%. And it's more than tripled in the past 20-25 years to over 15% average. It's not uncommon to see cannabis in the dispensaries in the 20 to 30% THC range. And this is due to genetic engineering, so using like fertilizers and pesticides and having chemists get in there and say, how can we increase the amount of THC in this weed, which does make it more addictive and stronger. But a lot of the views that you hear around cannabis are outdated views from a time when it was more like smoking some grass in a joint. Now we're talking about much stronger cannabis. And also especially extracts. So solvent-based extracts, as I mentioned, wax, dab, shatter, BHO. Essentially, you have people in labs taking a bunch of cannabis and trying to extract as much THC out of it as they can. So I found this paper that said 54 to 69%, can exceed 80. I've had old friends, drug dealers, say, you know, they have some that's 90-95% and it just looks like a clear white sheet. So pretty crazy. So what this girl here is doing a dab. And this thing here is called a dab rig. And the way it works, if you haven't seen it, maybe some of you have, this thing is called a nail, and you heat that sucker piping hot with a blowtorch, usually. And it's like glowing red. And then you drop the extract down in there, and you put on this cap, which is called a carb cap, and that helps with like ventilation. But essentially you're like high temperature vaporizing this THC, and then you suck it down into your lungs. It attaches to those little spindles in your lungs and goes straight to your bloodstream. So in about 3 minutes ish, you will feel that. So my best friend, who was pictured smoking the blunt, he did one of these, and you know, sometimes you'll see like people getting egos in this area, and somebody will be like, hey, just give me a small one, and they'll think it's funny to give a giant one. which is pretty dangerous. In the case of my friend, he got one that was totally ginormous, way too big. It was probably like 0.2 to 0.25 grams. And he hit that dab and he got up and he passed out and his head hit a rafter. Thankfully he was okay. He got back up like a minute later. But I've seen that happen in other places. Definitely like strong hallucinations, visuals with dabs. I didn't include much, but also like you've probably all heard stories of people eating way too many edibles or like a pot brownie and just like it's super powerful. So yeah, so it's just a different animal. Yes?
What do you think the reason is for like that passing out when they stand up? Because I've seen it before too, and like heard stories of it, but what do you think like makes someone pass out when they stand up after smoking?
Yeah. I've never thought about it, but it could partially be due to oxygen deprivation. Cause like if you ever hit one of these, they, you're coughing like a madman for 5 minutes. If you hit a giant one, you're like, you're choking and like, the resin that builds up on the bottom of this, it's sticky. So I imagine it looks the same way in your lungs. That could be it. Excess dopamine, which I'll get into. I don't know exactly, but it probably has to do with oxygen deprivation. So this is really complicated. I don't expect you to try and understand this because I don't even fully understand it, but what I want you to take away is that THC has effects on dopamine. So this is a dopamine receptor and synapse, nerve endings. And essentially what THC does is it binds to both CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors, which make up the endocannabinoid system. And through THC's binding to the CB1 receptors, it has effects on the dopamine in your body. This is through relatively complex mechanisms, but essentially it has indirect and direct effects on the dopamine, and then it increases the dopamine in the synapse, and it's like a huge hit of dopamine. Dopamine is involved in reward, motivation, and drive. It's been described also as a neuromodulator because you always have some level of dopamine in your system. It can be a baseline, it can be risen, it can be dropped. There are non-drug ways to increase the dopamine in your body. If you've ever heard of doing like a cold plunge, like I've done cold plunges sometimes and I get out and I feel like I'm on cocaine, which I have done cocaine, so I know what that feels like. But also meth, cocaine, dopamine, those things all will give you a huge spike in dopamine. So what happens when you repeatedly add dopamine to your brain from an external source is that your body makes less of it naturally. So you may have heard endogenous or exogenous. Endogenous just means making it naturally. Exogenous means getting it from an external source. So you have less endogenous or naturally produced dopamine when you are chronically overstimulating your dopamine receptors, which makes sense because it's like you are adding this thing constantly and your body's saying, I don't need to make as much of it on my own because I'm already getting it from somewhere else. And what's really important again to note here is the dose response effects. So higher dose THC will have stronger effects on the dopamine system. So as we talked about with potency levels rising, and especially with extracts, you're getting a way, way bigger hit of dopamine when you're using that. So don't worry about the brain too much there. But the blue dots are where the CB1 receptors are distributed in the brain. Primarily where the dopamine is happening is in these like limbic areas of the brain. So limbic just means deep. And the outer areas of the brain are called like cortical regions, the cortex. So just what's important to me is that this is happening in deep-seated areas of your brain. And these are more primal, like involved in food and sex and like water and shelter. So a lot of this addictive stuff is going on in these deeper areas of the brain. but there's also things happening in other areas of the brain, in the cortex, prefrontal cortex, for example. But what I want you to focus on more is that line graph. You see here like acute use, a big spike in the red line and the green line, which is also glutamate. So that's that spike in dopamine I was talking about. And then in cannabis use disorder, you can see here much lower levels of dopamine synthesis and release, meaning that when you're walking around and you're not high and you have a cannabis use disorder, you're making less dopamine, which means it's going to be harder for you to walk around and do stuff. And then when you go abstinent, your body starts to correct and you'll return to that normal baseline level of dopamine functioning. So these are changes in gray matter volume. Essentially that is size. So when you see reduced gray matter volume, the area of the brain is shrinking. So the orbitofrontal cortex is involved in cognitive flexibility, evaluation, and decision making. It is shrinks. When you chronically use cannabis, hippocampus involved in learning and memory shrinks, and the amygdala involved in emotion regulation, craving, and drug-seeking behavior. Also interesting is that the cerebellum has increased volume. It's not clear whether or not that's a good or a bad thing. There's positives and negatives to that. But the takeaway for me is that if you chronically use cannabis, you're going to have a harder time learning, memorizing things. You're going to have a harder time regulating your emotions. You're going to crave and seek drugs more, and you're going to have a hard time making decisions, which is kind of some of the things that we observe naturally. So I also want to talk about psychotic breaks. This may be new to you. This was new to me like a year ago, but I heard about it from a local psychiatrist named Dr. Craig Heacock, and he has a podcast called Back from the Abyss, which is really good. But essentially, one meta-analysis here showed that people who use cannabis had psychotic breaks 2.7 years sooner than people who did not, whereas people who just use any substance had a psychotic break 2 years sooner. So if you're predisposed to psychosis, it's likely that you're going to develop those symptoms at some point in your life. The point here is that that happens sooner when you introduce cannabis, and that's happening faster than just any drug use, which means maybe it's the cannabis. And also, doing cannabis or having cannabis use disorder at a younger age is associated with younger onset of psychosis symptoms. So why is that? Well, this paper is an fMRI study. It's a brain scan if you're not familiar. And primarily it was looking at COMT, which is an enzyme that's involved in the breakdown of dopamine and other neurotransmitters in the prefrontal cortex. And so different people have different expressions of COMT. So there's what's called genetic polymorphisms. Like basically different people have a different genetic profile, which will change how COMT works in the brain. And essentially what that just means is that people are going to break down dopamine at different speeds. So people who have the Val-Val polymorphism have a higher level of COMT activity. So the way to think about that is the dopamine is broken down faster. And Val-Met is kind of average breakdown of dopamine and other neurotransmitters. And Met-Met would be a low COMT activity, meaning that you're breaking down dopamine slower. So if you add some dopamine to your brain, you have more in there and it's breaking down slower. So why is that important? Well, this study looked at 87 people, gave them some weed, and they measured dysphoria, and they saw that people who have Met-Met polymorphism have a much higher rating of dysphoria when they smoke THC, not under the placebo, but that makes sense because you're adding a bunch of dopamine to your brain and then your body cannot process it as fast. And having excess dopamine in your brain is related to the development of psychosis. So additionally, this area of the brain called the hippocampus midbrain striatum, it's a lot of words, but it's just a network of different regions of the brain that are involved in psychosis risk. So this graph is showing functional connectivity. And what functional connectivity is essentially how much these different areas of the brain are talking to one another. So when you see a breakdown in functional connectivity, it means that these different areas of the brain are talking to each other less, which is a problem. Essentially the breakdown of this area of the brain is a risk factor for psychosis. And you see here, the people with MACP, again, breaking down dopamine much slower. When they're given THC, these areas of the brain are breaking down. And you can look at that like reality is breaking down a little bit. So essentially, that's kind of complicated. I tried to explain it in a relatively simplistic way, but the takeaway is that different people process dopamine differently, and the people that process it slower are gonna have a higher breakdown of that area of the brain and higher dysphoria. Yes, go ahead.
Makes me think of Brad's study regarding, have you seen his about the hypodopaminergic and rates of addiction? Talking about, essentially, I'm going to mess it up and I hope he doesn't critique me too much because he's going to listen, is addiction potential resides in the genetic predisposition for hypodopaminergic pathways within the brain. And addicts are looking for the spike or the hit of dopamine, and that's what causes or leads to risk-taking behaviors and such. Makes me think of with the MACP having a slower breakdown of dopamine. I see that this is relating it to psychotic breaks, but then I wonder what the correlation is with MACP and addiction, because if they are breaking down the dopamine slower or less, they're having more dopamine readily available. I wonder if that is hyperdopaminergic and they're less impulsive. They do risk-taking behaviors less. They're looking for that hit of dopamine less. And I was just wondering if there was, I think it would be interesting to see that relationship.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I have a friend who used to be a biologist. Now he's a Chinese medicine practitioner, which is pretty cool. But I was talking to him about this and just saw him this morning, and he was mentioning, like, what is it about people with MACP polymorphism that they're always breaking down dopamine differently, right? Which is your point. So how do they normally go about life? And that's how I've often felt, having a lot of addictive tendencies outside of just using weed. Like, I feel like I'm always searching for
a dopamine hit.
Or a hit. So yeah, it's that's another question to think more about, but good point. Thanks, Cody. Yeah, and this just shows adjusted hazards ratio, and just a point to take away from this is that young men are more predisposed to these psychotic breaks, possibly because of the fact that the prefrontal cortex takes a long time to develop, and it is slower in males, and it's stronger and grows faster in females. But in general, young people are going to have a less developed prefrontal cortex. And yeah, it's not a good idea to introduce a bunch of drugs that are going to change your neural circuitry while it's still developing, so I wouldn't recommend that. But in particular, the people who are at risk are young men, and so exposing young men to high-dose THC can be risky. We don't know who's going to have that COMT mutation, the MET mutation. I tried to find numbers online. It looks like about a quarter of people, and there's a lot of different differences in race and stuff, but about 25% of Caucasian people seem to have a COMT MET polymorphism. So this individual here is Johnny. Yes,
Did they say anything about gender differences? They said race, but was there any gender differences in the MET?
I don't know about gender differences in MET, but in general, men are more predisposed to psychotic breaks than women. Yes, Ryan.
Cole, if you said it and I missed it, I apologize. Is there any way to do any gene study on that to see if that COMT variable was present?
I know that you can measure COMT with like at-home genetic test, so you should be able to measure for the polymorphism relatively easily. Yeah. So this individual here is named Johnny. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Johnny actually got a scholarship to CSU. I'm not sure if he actually went. I believe he's from Castle Rock, which is down in the Denver area. But he is a young man, unfortunately, who developed psychosis following THC use and committed suicide. His mother runs an organization called Johnny's Ambassadors. And so the reason I bring this up is to take it out of the cerebral sort of intellectual world of talking about genes and such, and give a real world example. So I'll just read it because reading it does a better job than me explaining it. Johnny had a 4.0 GPA and a perfect 800 out of 800 score on the SAT math portion. He attended church and youth group and did regular family things. At age 14, Johnny began smoking marijuana when he attended a high school party and wanted to try to get high with his friends. At 16, he moved on to dabbing high THC products like wax and shatter. At age 18, he experienced psychosis and delusional episodes, a suicide attempt, and by 19, he was diagnosed with THC abuse severe and schizoaffective disorder from cannabis-induced psychosis. Tragically, despite our repeated efforts at rehab and support, he refused to take the antipsychotic medication he now needed, and he died by suicide on November 20th, 2019, convinced the mob was after him and everyone knew everything about him. So, super sad. I don't know how rare the THC-induced psychosis is. I don't want to overplay the prevalence, but for certain individuals, most likely with that polymorphism, they're going to be at risk, and so like young men doing dabs it can be scary. Also, cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So again, I didn't learn about this until recently. Like a few months ago, I met somebody who has this. And the way he described it was like a ticking time bomb where the more weed he smokes, the shorter the fuse got. And at any point in time with that short fuse, if he smokes weed, he's going to start vomiting violently. And for him, the only thing that would stop it is going to the hospital and getting a morphine drip, which is pretty intense. These are called the Rome-5 criteria. These have been proposed to diagnose cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, but essentially it's like cyclical vomiting type behavior after prolonged and excessive cannabis use. And if you stop smoking, the vomiting stops, so it goes away. Strangely, hot baths and showers seem to stop the vomiting. I don't know if the individual I talked to knew that or not, but that's why it says it may be associated with pathologic bathing behavior. So just, another weird thing, again, probably pretty rare. Additionally, I just want to mention that cannabis use disorder often does not occur in isolation. However, more severe cannabis use disorders are going to be associated with higher levels of co-occurring mental health conditions as well as other substance use disorders. These are kind of some of the things that you see: borderline personality disorder, bipolar 1, PTSD. This is what you see a lot of the time, and a lot of other co-occurring substance use disorders, which kind of makes sense. A lot of people are using a lot of cannabis, a lot of alcohol, maybe other things. It's just important to note, and again, the more severe the substance use, or in general, substance use disorder, but also cannabis use disorder, the more likely you are to have other co-occurring conditions. So I want to give you a few just thoughts about different treatments in case in your careers you ever come by this and want to know what to do. These are evidence-based therapies that have been looked at a little bit. There's really not a lot of research out there though about this. I'm assuming you've all heard of CBT. But in the context of cannabis use disorder, it focuses on identifying triggers and preventing relapse. Importantly though, it's been shown not to be any better than treatment as usual, so take that into consideration. Motivational enhancement therapies, I believe y'all mentioned you're already kind of learning about MI, but MI is kind of a process-oriented counseling orientation, I guess, which focuses on reflective listening, open questions, not judging people, and kind of getting into the mind of the part of them that wants to quit. Motivational enhancement therapies, pack that all into like 1 or 2 sessions, maybe as many as 4. Contingency management is just positive reinforcement, so giving somebody a voucher or some kind of reward for having a negative urinalysis test. And then one clinical trial at least looked at all of them combined. So using all these skills together, which in general I would say in counseling is kind of a good idea. Pull from your different toolkits. And that seems to work well. There's one very preliminary study of ketamine-assisted therapy, which I know about, for cannabis use disorder, and some stuff on mindfulness, which may be helpful. Pharmacological treatments, there's no FDA-approved medication for cannabis use disorder, but some things that have been looked at, dronabinol is essentially THC in a capsule, but it doesn't get you high. I don't know how that works, but it gets rid of withdrawal symptoms, and it doesn't really actually help you stop smoking. So that seems like an ineffective medication, if you ask me. A lot of people talk about CBD for cannabis use disorder. I found that it didn't really help me. I tried to use that to stop my cravings, but it really just distracted me. The most I did in a day was like 200 milligrams, but I found a study and it was like, they looked at 200 milligrams a day, 400 milligrams a day, and 800 milligrams a day. And then they were like, we're just not gonna look at 200 because it doesn't work. So you're looking at 400 to 800 milligrams of CBD every day, which if you've ever bought CBD, that's pretty damn expensive. I thought I found some cheap good stuff for like 1,500 milligrams for $40. So if you look at it, you're spending like $20 a day on CBD, which is like $600 a month, which seems super costly. And even then it doesn't work that good. So you're SOL, I guess. But is there any reason to get abstinent? In my case, I'm abstinent. Maybe not for everybody, but I came across this quote after my lapse. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that I had a lapse, not a relapse. I'll talk a little bit about that and why this quote was so huge for me. But essentially, it was like a Saturday, and the next day I was going to prepare a talk actually for Ryan's neuropharmacology class on cannabis use disorder. And I was having really, really intense cravings. I was pretty lonely, to be honest, finding new friends in a new place. Never having lived in Colorado before. And I thought that smoking some weed with somebody would bring me some connection. That fell through, but I already talked myself into smoking some weed. So on this particular Saturday, I was living in a grad student house, and there was some weed in a jar in our shed. And I took an old Coke can out of a recycling bin. I put it in it. I found a sewing needle. I poked a bunch of holes in it for a bowl, and then I stabbed the side with a screwdriver for a carb, and I made a little Coke can pipe, and then I smoked in our shed in the dark, and just had a little bowl, and I got high, and it was pretty uneventful. And the next day, I was putting together this presentation on cannabis use disorder, and quickly found myself rearranging my day to get to the dispensary and smoke some weed in the evening, even though my mind was telling me like, hey, no, I'm just gonna use it a little bit on the weekends, and then suddenly I'm like trying to figure out how I can get there and smoke tonight, which is just classic addictive behavior. So I was putting together this talk, and came across this quote. I had a really bad headache in this area of my head, right behind my eyes, which it's called like a bilateral headache. I often get unilateral headaches, so on one side of my head, but in this particular morning I had a really bad headache. Nothing I did made it go away. Drinking coffee, going for a walk in sunlight, water, ibuprofen, nothing helped. I was like, what is with this splitting headache? And then I read this paper about the orbitofrontal cortex shrinking, and I realized that's the area of my brain, right behind my eyes, where I'm feeling this pain. And then I came to this quote, and I'll read it, and then I'll talk about why it's important. So it says, what is nevertheless also apparent is a potential for some neurobiological alterations to be reversed during extended abstinence. This emphasizes the adaptive and continued dynamic nature of the brain when drug-free. However, animal models overwhelmingly demonstrate protracted molecular alterations subsequent to THC use, suggesting that underlying molecular and cellular processes may remain sensitive to subsequent drug use later in life. Even if general neurobiological features appear relatively normal, the neurobiological mechanisms that maintain these protracted effects are likely epigenetic processes, which means that they are malleable. As such, the drug abstinence window may be a critical period for targeting these molecular processes to improve long-term outcomes. So that's a lot of jargon. Don't expect you to follow that or make sense of it as I read it out loud. But essentially what this is saying is that the brain repairs itself when you stop smoking, and because there's these epigenetic pathways that are involved in smoking, if you reintroduce the weed later, the brain is going to go back to those same alterations and essentially reinstate that same damage. So for me, my headache was kind of a real world feeling of I reactivated this same thing in my brain that I've done all this work being abstinent to get rid of. So, but in my case, again, I was smoking heavily since a teenager, and so the chronic heavy use for long periods of time are when you're going to start to see those effects in your brain. And so yeah, getting abstinent can reverse those effects, but if you smoke again, it can undo all the healing you got. So that's what convinced me to be abstinent. So I also want to provide you with some resources. So North Point, they see adolescents, they also see adults, I just found out. They have a really good reputation. I met some people from there yesterday, and my coworker used to work there. They have a treatment program in Loveland, marijuana rehab. The Recovery Village at Palmer Lake has marijuana treatment and rehab. They're like a 3-hour drive though, so yeah, just take that into consideration. Aspen Ridge is another really good place. Some of you may do your internship there, I don't know, but they have an IOP and a PHP program that's intensive outpatient and partial hospitalization program if you're not familiar yet. They do marijuana and dual diagnosis treatment. They also have multiple locations. Choice House in Boulder is a marijuana rehab. ThriveWorks in Littleton has a marijuana treatment program. And then me at Inner Life Adventures, I can help. I see people for cannabis use disorder and co-occurring conditions, as well as just general mental health. Yep.
I work at Choice House up in Boulder.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I actually work. I was there last night, but we get so many marijuana clients and a lot of people just coming in. A lot of the time it's the younger crowd, like the marijuana people that are going to the facility. But I love it there. I love it.
Yeah, good to know. I'd never heard of them actually, so
It's awesome.
until I just put them in there, but I was like, I don't know what they do, but that's cool. So I'm also getting together a group here in Fort Collins. We're calling it Questioning Cannabis Consumption. It's going to be me and my coworker Mike, who's also an LPCC, and he's kind of questioning his cannabis use as well right now. And we want it to be the kind of space where you can drop in, get support. We'll have like psychoeducation. So some of the stuff I talked about today, I'll share. And it's just going to be like group discussion, group processing. I went to a bunch of AA groups when I was first starting to get sober and found that was like not really my crowd. Alcohol wasn't my problem as much. I only had a problem with it when I stopped smoking for like a drug test or something. Anyway, I want that kind of space where people can come and be supported in community by individuals.
It's the age range you're opening that up to, Cole?
Yeah, we're still working out the details. I was thinking like maybe at least 16, probably 16 years old minimum, but I don't know if there's good reason to only see adults, but I think we'll probably open it up to minimum of 16 years old, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we're still figuring out a lot of the details. But yeah, and it'll probably be Friday nights.
Good selection of the day and time.
Yeah, I like my chill Friday nights. I'm usually watching Netflix and hanging out, but that's a good time to help people. I'm also really excited about like doing different activities and experientials. So this would be outside of the normal time. But these are things that I've found for myself. I think there's a lot of enjoyment in sobriety, which often gets overlooked by the difficulty of stopping and being abstinent at first. if you have a lot of shit that you've done in your life, if you've done a lot of damage and you get sober, your life is going to be hard for sure. But in abstinence, long term, there's a lot of enjoyment in life. So I like going on hikes. I've gotten to do some breathwork journeys, which is really amazing. You get into some pretty crazy altered states just with your breath. And I recently got to do a tea ceremony, which was pretty cool. So tea can be really powerful as well. But I just want to introduce people to these different ways of doing things that aren't necessarily focused around cannabis or other substance use. Yeah, so we're getting that started soon. If you have any referrals or anything, I'll drop my contact info at the end of this. And Brad's got my information also. So yeah. Closing remarks, I got into some pharmacology stuff. Didn't want to scare you too much with all that. It can be pretty deep. Hopefully I explained it in a way that makes sense. But what I want people to take away is that cannabis use disorder looks different from other forms of addiction. Obviously, you know, like you're not like drunk driving and killing people or like on the side of the road with open sores, which are real things. But it does have harmful effects on the brain when you use it in heavy amounts over long periods of time. And especially when you take into consideration the fact that THC rates have increased drastically and concentrates are widely available, as well as like the social norms around cannabis and some of the outdated attitudes. There are a lot of risks that you're dealing with. So some individuals in particular also, as we talked about, who have that meth-met polymorphism will be at risk for even more severe consequences. So we just need to be careful. Yeah, so here's my references. I'm not going to read them out loud, but they're there, and I'm happy to send them to you. I can also share my slides if people want it, but essentially, I would recommend this book at the bottom, Cannabis Use Disorders, if you ever need a primer, if you feel like reading a textbook after you're out of grad school. And it's a bunch of papers. johnnysambassadors.com is where I found some of my graphs and stuff. Yeah, so my email is cole@innerlifeadventures.com, so feel free to reach out if you have questions or referrals for the group or also see individuals. And I've left a few minutes for questions, so yeah, go ahead.
Have they started parsing out the difference between smoking and edibles? Because I know that the active compound is completely different within the brain when you smoke and eat. Are they just saying that as of now with cannabis use disorder, it's blanket with THC? Or have they started seeing any differences between smoke and edibles?
Like as far as diagnosing a cannabis use disorder?
Psychotic breaks, addiction potential, stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, it's like a different route of administration with edibles, right? Because you're orally ingesting it, but you're still going to see the same spikes in dopamine that you see through smoking or dabbing. So I didn't talk as much about edibles, but you would observe the same kind of effects. You may be familiar, there's kind of qualitative differences in how the experience feels. But still the primary psychoactive ingredient is going to be the THC in edibles, so they're normally...
That's not my understanding. My understanding is with the edibles is you eat it and then it's metabolized and it's 5 by your liver and then it's 5-methoxy ... that actually binds to the CB receptors within the brain. It's THC. When you eat THC, it's not THC binding.
You're saying it metabolizes
into a
differently
completely,
something else.
yes, 5 to 10 times more psychoactive than THC.
Okay.
But it is a completely different compound that is acting on the brain when you eat versus smoke. And I feel like there would be reason to believe that there's differences in some of these effects. And I was just wondering if there's any parsing of that yet.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I was just thinking like I normally see edibles measured in amounts of THC, but I see what you're saying, that it's metabolized differently. I don't know, to be short, but a lot of the research in general is very new and still developing. So that's just important to take into consideration. but yeah, I don't know as much about edibles specifically. Yeah, but good question.
So you said that you moved to Colorado. When you moved to Colorado, did you find it harder to be sober? Because I feel like Colorado has like this, I mean, everyone knows Colorado as like the weed state. Like when I moved, because I'm from Virginia, so I moved here and everyone was like, oh, you smoke weed? Like everyone's like, it's like the weed state. So like, did you think it was harder to be sober here given the reputation it has?
Yes, thanks for asking. Absolutely. Yeah, actually, I moved here sight unseen, and when I got here, I like drove 16 hours from Arkansas, and I was driving through Kansas and Oklahoma, which is a terrible drive. And I got to my house. Sorry if you had to go through that. But I got to my house with a bunch of grad students, and I walked around the back, and everybody was there hanging out, all my new roommates, my landlord, and they had out bowls of weed and beers, and I'm like, shit. And I really wanted to connect with these people. I'm like, this is gonna be my new crowd. And I was like, okay, I'm tired. I'm gonna ride my bike, find some food. And they were like, let's all go down to the brewery and we'll get beers and there's a food truck. And so I found myself in my first few hours at a brewery, and I was, one of 2 people out of 8 that was not drinking alcohol, and I was nearly sober. So it was extremely hard, yeah. People often rely on cannabis and alcohol as an easy way to connect and socialize. It's hard to isolate yourself from those because there are strong points of connection. And yeah, I did really struggle. Being sober, not knowing people, not meeting people, and feeling like that was the point of connection that everybody relies on. Obviously, Fort Collins, huge brewery culture, Colorado, huge weed culture. I want to give you all time to like go to the bathroom. I think your next class is at 1. Is it at 1?
I think the instructor gave him a little bit of time.
There, guy.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Can you email me your slides, Cole?
Yes.
Thank you.
I still got your email on the Apollo State.
Okay.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thanks so much. This has been really awesome. I really appreciate you all coming out today. Huge turnout. And yeah, this topic is very near and dear to me because I struggled with it. And it's really hard to talk about it sometimes because of some of those outdated beliefs. I have a good following on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, check me out. It's just Cole Butler. But I started talking about this issue and got a lot of pushback from the professional cannabis community. If you can imagine, people working in dispensaries and stuff probably aren't going to want to hear this. But lately, meeting more therapists and stuff, people are pretty open to it, so I appreciate all your openness to hearing this and seeing where I'm coming from, so thank you.
Thank you, Cole.
Thank you everyone for coming. I think Cole's gonna stick around for a few minutes afterwards if you wanna have more one-on-one conversations, but also please help yourself to more pizza before you go to class.